Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this special event being co-hosted by the United Religions Initiative here in North America and Atheists United, a nonprofit organization based here in Los Angeles. For those of you that do know me, good seeing you. And for those of you that don't, my name is Tahil Sharma. I'm the regional coordinator for North America in North America at the United Religions Initiative. And I'm really excited to start this conversation today because we are addressing a very major elephant in the room when it comes to talking about the interfaith movement and the inclusion of secular people. In the last 3 years of working at the United Religions Initiative, we've made it very clear that we as an organization, present in over 110 countries with 1,100 member organizations or cooperation circles. We're a large network that really likes to profess to this idea of being radically inclusive. But sometimes there's a big struggle with trying to include people who may be atheists, secular humanists, agnostic, or non-believers of any form. And this conversation is getting to talk about that in a really unique way. Rather than hearing about the perspectives of why not just the radical inclusion is important, but why we need to hear the grievances of those who have been trying to do this work for so long. I've been doing work for interfaith cooperation for over 11 years now. And this struggle of trying to include secular people has been one that I've noted in almost every community that I've been in. There are some rare exceptions here and there, but that's to say that there is a big struggle with this idea of what it actually means to be truly inclusive, where it's easier to be able to include certain communities that might have controversial opinions that still happen to be religious or spiritual, but still not include people who may not have a specific belief system or not have a belief system that includes the divine at all. So this conversation is an opportunity to listen to some important voices on this idea of being able to do interfaith work as a secular person and having the opportunity to engage secular communities in this larger interfaith movement going forward. I have the unique pleasure of being able to know and collaborate with and work with the folks you're going to be hearing from today, who come into this space from their own experience of interfaith cooperation at various levels of society in different sectors. And they'll be able to give you some really honest opinions and some good opportunities to do better at engaging secular individuals and communities. So with that in mind, I'd like to pass it on to my colleague, Evan Clark, who's the executive director of the organization co-sponsoring today's event, Atheists United. We've known each other for several years now, and it's been such a pleasure to work with him. And Evan, I'll let you take the floor.
I'm having trouble unmuting myself. One second.
Okay, should work now. Thank you. I appreciate the intro, Tahil. It is a pleasure to be here. It is so exciting to be in this space. For those of you that know my background, I got into the secular movement through a small university called California Lutheran University, and that sprung-boarded me into a activist lifestyle and a lot of interfaith background. So it is an absolute pleasure that we get to co-host this event with URI, and we have some incredible panelists for you. Yeah, it's going to be a great conversation. But before we do that, I need to give everyone a quick and dirty 10,000-foot welcome to the secular community. If you are new and haven't heard much about us before, there's a huge difference between the larger, 1 in 3 Americans that identify as some form of non-religious or secular, and the intentional community building and activist types. And if you give me a few minutes, I will try to dive into those for you. So let's do a quick presentation, and then we'll hop right into the panel. Give me a thumbs up if you can see this screen that I am sharing. You all rock. Thank you so much. All right. So today's event is co-hosted by Atheists United. We are a local organization in Los Angeles, California. We were founded in 1982 and are one of the largest atheist communities in the United States today. We have over 16 programs, we serve hundreds of people across California, and we have multiple chapters. One thing we're going to need to understand is that the secular community has organizations, it has institutions, and I'm going to show you some of those in a minute, but this isn't just a dispersed group of random people. This is a political and social movement. But first, we have to define what this word secular means and why so many of us are using this, who are doing this work. So for us, secular is often used as an umbrella term. It has identities such as atheist, agnostic, humanist, skeptic, and free thinker under it. These are some of the most popular terms you'll find that people who are secular identify as. Everyone's identity is a personal choice. But politically, we also find that there are certain labels like atheist, humanist, and secular that we most often organize around. And you'll notice a lot of our national and international organizations have terms like that included in them. Each of these are technically slightly different. I do not have time to get into all of them right now, but please follow up. I'd love to have a longer conversation with you if you're curious about the nuances between some of these. But at the end of the day, they all are secular. And the classic definition of secular is worldly and natural. It is without any supernatural or theistic ideas attached to them. One thing you have to know is that 3 in 10 US adults now identify as some form of unaffiliated, non-religious, or secular. This is the fastest growing religious demographic in the United States. I'm using religious demographic as the language that is used by polling organizations like Pew Research and is it PRI? I'm blanking on the name. Yes, PRI. Yeah, this has been studied for a long time, religious demographics and changes, but what we're seeing is especially young people are moving away from religion at the highest rates in US history. Millennials and Gen Zs, we've more than tripled the amount of unaffiliated religious identity since the 90s. If you compare boomers to Gen Z, you see an absolute explosion in unaffiliated religious identity. You'll often see in research done by Pew, they call this group the nuns. It's kind of a weird term. We didn't choose that, I can tell you that, but it is the catch-all term that is used for what we would call this secular demographic in the United States. I'm speaking specifically about the United States today. Globally, this is different in different regions, and we can get into that if you have questions about it later. Now, the secular movement is a bunch of national and international and local organizations working towards shared political and social goals. A lot of these center their work around separation of church and state, around secular identity and human rights, and around cultural acceptance and cultural expression and organization around our shared values as secular people. These are some of the largest national organizations. I don't have time to get into these, but I just wanted to give you a quick snapshot of what they look like if you want to do some Google searches. And those of us on this call have worked with most of these organizations before, so we can answer questions about them. I will say our movement is as diverse as the United States, meaning we have people that come from all backgrounds, that speak all languages, that come from different countries or grew up here. We have people who grew up religious. We have people who grew up secular. And our organizations each year better represent that diversity. So again, we have everything from ex-Muslims to Unitarian Universalist humanists who would identify as religious, fascinating enough. And then locally, we've been building community movements that look and feel a lot like the religious communities you're probably a part of if you identify as religious on this call. Organizations like mine in Los Angeles have been around for 40 years, and we're one of the older ones. Very few communities have existed for more than 50 years in the United States. But it doesn't mean that non-theists haven't existed. It's just the concept of organizing around nonprofits and building local institutions is a bit of a newer concept since we've started to collect more resources and maybe a bit more of a political need or political safety. Let's talk a little bit about some experiences that people identify as secular go through and why we both relate to a lot of marginalized religions and why we struggle to work with a lot of religions. We have to talk about stigma. There's a lot of misinformation and fear around secular people and secular beliefs. There's a lot of stereotypes. You survey Americans about who the most famous atheist is, Satan comes up as number one. Confusing, stigma-based, but that leads to stereotypes based on the beliefs people have attached to Satan. Discrimination we find in schools, in workplaces, visa applications. Atheists have both structurally and culturally faced tons of discrimination. Family rejection is something we're learning to study a lot more, but has always been well known in our community. And then violence. We see instances of this locally and regionally. And then the biggest examples are obviously internationally, where there are multiple countries where if I were to enter that country right now and have the job title of executive director of Atheists United, it would be legally allowed for them to sentence me to death just for having this identity. Let's talk about needs and desires. What's interesting is our community often looks and feels like a lot of religious communities in that we organize around very similar things. If you take belief out of the conversation, we organize around belonging. We organize around growth. We want to develop as human beings. We want to express ourselves. Some of our communities sing together and dance together and march together. Representation is a huge issue that gets discussed in our community, and the non-theistic community is possibly the least represented community in American politics today compared to its population. And then finally, action. Throughout history, religious communities, when they organize, they do something together. They organize for volunteer work or they organize for political change. Our community is no different. Language is really important. We find that in interfaith spaces and our culture at large, words like faith, spirituality, higher power, prayer, and religion are assumed. There's a normativity that's built around these words. But if you ask people who identify as some form of secular, who enter some of these secular communities, you find that these words often don't exist or are actively challenged. Our communities have built their own language and culture that do not include these most of the time. And if you care about inclusion, you're going to have to adapt some of the words you use to include our community. And we'll get into this as the conversation goes today, but there are lots of things you can do to be more inclusive with secular communities, including relationship building with secular leaders, avoiding prayer and including secular ritual, inclusive language, education about our community, which anyone on this call today would love to help you with, challenging religious privilege, sharing the stage, standing with us when we're attacked, shared resources, and asking questions. I think I'll stop there. We're going to move into our panel. I want to introduce Vanessa. Vanessa is the Dean of Associate Dean at USC for their Office of Religious Life, is an incredible secular leader, is on the board of the American Humanists Association, and is going to lead our panel today.
Great. Well, thank you so much for that presentation, Evan. It was a great way to launch us into today's talk. And I'm really delighted to be taking part in this conversation and to be joined by a few colleagues who I've known for a while and who will bring their own experiences and expertise to today's conversation. And so as Evan mentioned, I'm Vanessa Gomez-Brake, Associate Dean of Office of Religious and Spiritual Life, and I'll be moderating and participating in today's panel. Joining me as well, we have Sarah Levin, who is the founder of Secular Strategies. There you are. Hi, Sarah. And I believe we also have Debbie Goddard here, who is our Vice President, or the Vice President of Programs for American Atheists.
She is currently having some technological issues.
All right.
So we are hopefully trying to get her on as soon as we can.
Thank you for that. And then Evan, since you did present on the front end, I think you will also be weaving into our conversation. So I'm wondering if we can also bring Evan into the grid here as we get started. So thank you again for joining us today, everyone. I'm delighted to see such a big crowd and to see folks chiming in from all over the nation and the world. I'm delighted to be taking part in this conversation as a humanist and atheist myself who has been involved in interfaith activities since my own college years, and we're talking 20 years ago now. The subject of today's panel is of great interest and great relevance to my everyday work. And in case you're wondering, like an associate dean of religious and spiritual life, yeah, I exist in a university religious center and I work with all sorts of religious and non-religious folks, but so much of my humanistic worldview does come into play as to how I navigate this space. So today's event was described as such. It said, interfaith spaces aim to be radically inclusive by inviting people of different religious and spiritual backgrounds together. Yet many interfaith initiatives struggle to include people of secular worldviews, and especially those who are intentionally secular, which Evan explained, sort of the difference between the many and the few who are intentionally in secular community. So our panelists today come from a variety of backgrounds and perspectives, and they will share their experiences, their insights, and ideas on how we can promote better understanding and cooperation among people of different worldviews. Today's conversation will further explore these themes of engaging the spectrum of secular atheist identities in interfaith work, of challenging, of the various challenges we've faced by secular individuals who are engaged in interfaith spaces, as well as the opportunities to promote stronger alliances for the work of peace, justice, and healing. And so we hope today's conversation will spark thoughtful dialogue, that it will challenge your assumptions, and that it will encourage all of us to explore the possibilities of collaboration across religious and non-religious lines. And it looks like we are joined by Debbie today. Hi, Debbie. Welcome. Nice to see you.
Hi, sorry about my laptop fan.
Oh, all
now.
of us are no stranger to technical difficulties. We're all living that online life now. So to get us started, I wanted to just sort of unpack who we are in this space. And so I wonder if we could do maybe this isn't going to be quick, but just an abbreviated sort of introduction to one. Who are you, like in terms of your secular identity, maybe a bit of your secular identity story, and then how did you come to your secular works? So let's start with that. And I think we've heard a bit of Evan's story, so maybe we can start with you, Sarah.
Absolutely. Well, thank you everyone for being here. I have long felt that I was kind of the odd bird in the secular movement. I think that's changing because I was raised by firebrand atheists, and a lot of the folks that I was working with were, folks who went through a deconversion process or were at least raised religious. I think that's changing, given that there's just more and more, we have the most secular generation we've ever seen. So more and more people are being raised without religion. So it was really, talking about religion and politics at my kitchen table was pretty normal. But I also am culturally Jewish. And so I, live with a very strong cultural Jewish identity, as well as a very strong atheist and humanist identity, which is actually very common for a lot of Jews in the United States. And so when I went to college and I went looking for a secular group to be a part of, and found the Secular Student Alliance affiliate on my campus, and then went on to intern and then work for 6 years at the Secular Coalition for America. And I think the reason that I went directly for these groups isn't actually because I experienced a whole, I have a lot of privilege having grown up in really large metropolitan areas that were very diverse. I didn't have a lot of I definitely got some head turning and people asking questions sometimes, but I, for the most part, didn't experience discrimination on the basis of being an atheist. And I think that's actually important to note, because I think that's what allowed me to go directly into politics, because I wasn't seeking safety, which is a lot of the work that has to be done for folks who do not feel politically or socially safe as an atheist. And it's an interesting dynamic, because we kind of, our movement, I think, generally has to serve those two purposes. And the first and foremost has to be safety. And then we hope to then have enough folks who feel safe to then engage in the advocacy that I'm, the political advocacy that I'm engaged in. So that was kind of, very abbreviated version of my journey.
That's great. Let's go ahead and move on to Debbie.
Hi, everyone. I'm sorry again, my laptop fan. It doesn't like Interfaith. Yeah. So I've been involved in organized secularism now for almost just about my entire adult life, which is weird. I'm originally from Philadelphia. I just moved back to Philly. Sarah too. Just moved back to Philly last summer. But like Sarah, grew up in a big metro area, relatively diverse place, but went to Catholic school for 12 years. My mother is from Trinidad originally, and is culturally Catholic, but not committed religiously. My father was Jewish. So growing up, my siblings and I would accompany my dad to synagogue. We did some of the high holy days, celebrated things. I liked the ones that had food and not the ones that had not food, not eating. So it was a mixed bag, but in Catholic school, I thought that these were kind of, that religions work together, that, we all worship the same God, we just worship him in different ways kind of thing, until confirmation. And it was a big time for me to, in 6th grade, when we went through confirmation in school, for me to question Catholic doctrine and to realize that if Catholics are right, that Jews are wrong, and vice versa, to think about the people who hold these beliefs and the sort of doctrinaire commitment that we were being asked to make. And I wondered why there are so many stories, basically figured that there are a lot of stories out there that people have, and there are other reasons for having them to make sense of our lives. Still went to Catholic school, lost my scholarship in high school, partly because I was an atheist and partly because of my philosophy club. That interested me in asking more questions and getting involved in community building, having space for people to ask questions without getting in trouble. And that sort of evolved in my college years into helping organize groups. When I got more involved in other kinds of justice work and social justice advocacy, including racial justice and LGBTQ equality work, the opponents that we fought often used religion to justify their actions. And yet a lot of the people that I was working with, and particularly the younger people, were not religious and didn't have the same kinds of community institutions. So I ended up focusing more of my efforts on helping to foster good communities, social groups, activist groups, and ended up getting hired to do that work about 17 years ago now, 16 years ago. Wow. And I've been in it ever since. Now at American Atheists, part of my job there is to help support and foster community groups and to run our annual convention, which brings together about 500 people to celebrate their identities and share experiences.
Thank you, Debbie and Sarah. I think I'll go ahead and share a bit of myself, and then actually, Evan, based on what we heard from the other two, I think there's probably a bit more you might want to share about your own background that brought you to this secular work too. But personally, for myself, I'm a Filipina raised on Guam, so not in a huge metro area like these Philly folks over here. I was on a tiny island in the Pacific for much of my upbringing, and when I came stateside, I was faced with just the sheer amount of religious diversity, because all I had known was the Catholic tradition, and that was the majority of the belief systems of those in the Philippines and in Guam. And so I am to this day still consider myself culturally Catholic because that's how I was socialized, and that's how I came to understand the world around me. But it was only once I was in college that I finally felt empowered to explore my non-belief, because I had probably been an atheist since a very young age, but never used that terminology with family and with friends because it just didn't feel safe. And for myself personally, in terms of my own identity and sort of admitting what that meant in regards to my distancing from the Catholic tradition, but also didn't feel safe in a lot of the sort of overtly religious spaces that I was existing in. And so I'm glad that, 20 plus years later, I'm happily humanist, continue to wave the atheist flag, and that even on my university campus, that is something that really resonates with students, that I can be my authentic self while doing interfaith work. So that's a bit of sort of my story and how I sort of orient to my work. But Evan, is there anything more you'd like to share in this introductory section?
Sorry, this tablet, every time I mute it, it doesn't unmute. Okay. Yeah, so I grew up in rural Massachusetts. I think Guam's the closest to rural compared to these Philly types. But yeah, my parents sent me to Catholic school in first grade. I guess we have a lot of Catholic backgrounds here, but yeah, that's when I immediately figured out I'm a skeptic, I guess, without having any language for that. I challenged everything that came out of the CCD class to the point that I begged my parents to not go anymore to church by like first grade. I had a father who I don't think grew up very religious. So, of course you want to watch football on Sundays, not go to church. That's the cool thing to do. But yeah, ultimately, I think what inspired this whole work was attending California Lutheran University. And I discovered the word atheist by sixth grade. I started identifying as it publicly. And similarly, I got weird looks, but I think I was lucky. I grew up in a town that it just wasn't that big of a deal, where it wasn't talked that much. The Unitarians, I think, had the biggest church in town, which is rare. And yeah, in college, though, in California in 2008 and 2009, the big fight was Proposition 8, which was gay marriage in California. And as we started to organize, I realized every argument for banning gay marriage was religious that we were coming up against. And the LGBT community that I was working with didn't have a space to talk about religion necessarily. So I created the Secular Student Alliance Club on that campus and discovered that most people actually grew up religious and weren't skeptics in first grade like me, and that there's a lot of recovering from religion that happens in our space. And there's a lot of social needs that we're not serving unless we recreate community spaces and build a supportive network for these people. So yeah, I'll argue I was the first grade skeptic.
Great. Well, thank you all for those shares. It's nice to know how we've all arrived to this space in our particular areas of secular engagement. And so we're going to dig in deeper now in terms of all things interfaith, challenges, opportunities, all of that. And maybe before we even get into those details, we can talk a bit more about how we came to engage with interfaith work, or sharing of an experience of interfaith work as atheist, humanist, or whatever identifier you choose. And so I will model this because early on, as I said, I was coming from Guam and I came stateside for college. I went to a public institution, and but I decided to study religion. So of course, I was amongst all sorts of people of a variety of religious backgrounds and so forth. But I got extra credit to do an interfaith dialogue, but at my school, we called it an inter-worldview dialogue. And I remember reaching out to the facilitator, who happened to be an Episcopalian woman minister. And I just wanted, I had a sense like all students were welcome, but because I was an atheist, I was just like, I don't know, do they want an atheist in this inner worldview dialogue? And what she said was, yes, absolutely, and we need you. It wasn't just an open invitation, but she really wanted my perspective in that room. And that conversation, which lasted probably 10 weeks of a semester, every single week coming together with people of a variety of religious and spiritual backgrounds, it helped me to understand my values. It helped me to articulate why I believed what I believed, and in conversation with my peers. And so that created a transformative space for me. And so whenever I talk about interfaith, I talk about that first experience because it was so well facilitated and thought out and managed. Yes, it was led by Christian leadership, and yet she had the perspective to bring in different voices and challenge our every perspective that was shared in the room. And so I just wanted to share that because that was my introduction to interfaith, which in a college campus can feel a lot safer, I think, than maybe as we get out into these community spaces. But because that facilitator had created that space so intentionally, I felt really secure in being myself, my authentic self in that space. So let me open this up to all of you. Tell us a bit about your own experience with interfaith works.
I can start if no one else is going to. All right. So I think probably the most significant, first step I took into interfaith work was working at the Secular Coalition for America and working with allies, organizational allies, on issues where we had mutual interests. So I've done a lot of work with groups like the Interfaith Alliance, Catholics for Choice, Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty. These are great faith-based and interfaith organizations that really share our vision of religious freedom and pluralism, that in which religion and government is separate, and we protect the rights of people of all faiths and none, and really seek to undo what's been done over the last 2 decades, which is to codify a very narrow set of Christian beliefs that is not representative of all Christians into our laws and impose them on people. And I joined the DNC Interfaith Council, I think it was in 2019, and that's been a really phenomenal experience. I was definitely nervous about how I would be received, and I would say the vast majority of people that I've interacted with have been very welcoming. And I think, the best experience was hearing from folks who, told me how important it was to see me representing our community on that council. So for example, a DNC member, Michael Barefoot, who I've worked with, he's the one who really has been supportive of me being on the council from the beginning. He identifies as a pagan and felt very strongly represented, even though I'm not pagan, I'm an atheist, but I think we end up in the same spaces as religious minorities that aren't typically included in interfaith spaces. And I saw one of our attendees mentioning that in the chat earlier. And so, really it was a validating experience to know that I was, my representation was in service to other folks who felt previously that this council didn't represent them. That said, there have been challenges. And while the vast majority of people have been welcoming, I have had instances in which, and I'm not going to name any names, of course, but I've interacted with folks who straight up told me that they didn't think that I belonged in an interfaith space. I had people tell me that it was, that interfaith spaces are just for people of faith, and that I'm kind of crashing the party. I've had, there's a lot of more kind of subtlety around it sometimes, where it's kind of, just avoidance, I think, of talking about the issues, right? I think there's this tendency to want to have a sort of kumbaya moment where we avoid, hard, controversial issues. But the reality is that, people's lives and livelihoods are at stake with, our politics, and we can't just avoid those issues, right? So I do find myself being the one to kind of bring up issues that maybe people don't want to talk about, but that are really, really important, and impacting people in a real way. And I think the last kind of challenge I'll share there has been just, and we'll talk about this more in terms of inclusion later in the presentation, but just not being included by default, right? And having to kind of be the one to catch whether it's, whether I'm helping with writing a statement or putting a panel together, or deciding how an event is going to be run. There's so many moments where I find myself catching exclusionary practices and exclusionary language. And I'm really glad I can be there to address them. But it really speaks to, if I wasn't the lone secular voice in this space, this would not be an inclusive space of my community. And there's just so far to go when you have kind of a hesitancy to even have the conversation, and we're not included by default, and these kind of exclusionary practices and language are what's normal. It just speaks to how important it is for us to be in these spaces.
Thank you, Sarah, and for naming some of those challenges. We'll definitely dig in a bit deeper on those after this question. Debbie or Evan, would you like to add your voice?
I'll go quickly because I haven't had that much success with it. I have tried to join groups, even in college, which was 20 years ago. We're talking now. It might have looked different if it were 10 years ago because the landscape did shift. But 20 years ago, when I reached out to different networks on campus or different campuses because I attended different institutions, they weren't interested in seeing secular people be involved. I think I learned early on that a lot of the interfaith groups of different kinds at the foundation still very much valued faith and religion and belief, and therefore viewed organized secular people as a threat. And that's been reinforced in a lot of different ways. Again, I think there was a big shift, particularly on college campuses about 10 or so years ago. We talked about it being a change for young people who were children after 9/11 who were much more interested in pluralism as a result. I was not in college at that time, but even more recently, working at American Atheists, this year I attended a International Religious Freedom Summit representing American Atheists with other people, and thought that with the shift in attitudes and landscape, that would be a great place for me to reach out to other organizations and see ways that we might work together or encourage involvement at the local level for groups that are affiliated with us. And so I was going up to exhibitor tables like, hey, you do this, you have this network, it's interfaith, you have, Christians, Jews, and Muslims. How about, considering the growing numbers of secular people, I'd love to work with you. I work with American Atheists, and we want to encourage more of our local people to get involved. And the response was often a very physical recoiling, like, oh, that's not it. And I was like, but all your language on your posters and your signs and your material says, your goals, which are our goals, like pluralism and fostering understanding and working on issues of importance in the community. That's what we want to do too. And if we connect, that's good. And they're like, yeah. So that when I say like not success, it's those kinds of things I'm thinking about. The other place I've seen groups is places like and asked about inclusion is in things like racial justice work. Often when there are rallies or events or news media looking for spokespeople from different communities, they look at religious leaders. They look to those institutions. And so we've seen political events, we've seen different coalitions built that are focused on people of color and are almost entirely made up only of religious leaders representing their constituencies and leaving out a lot of others, and with certain things reinforced. And I've tried to worm my way into some of those groups. Even recently, having moved to Philly, there's a group here that does a lot of justice work. That's a religious coalition, and I'm curious about whether they'd be open to secular involvement. But broadly, I haven't had much success being part of that space, even though I've tried to join. And I'll turn it to Evan.
Thanks. Yeah. I've had a lot of varied experiences. I've been in a lot of different types of interfaithy spaces over the years. But what's funny is when I started by doing the opposite, like my first interaction with religious groups when I was in an institution was a debate in college. And I quickly learned how terrible that is. Not even just for networking, but it also turns out the worst of the non-theist community. And it pits theism and atheism in this never-ending battle for belief supremacy. And that is what I've realized is not the most important value for me and for the communities that I work with. It's taken, it took me a few years, even after college, to like fully accept this. But really the challenge most religious communities, not the beliefs, but the communities of people that represent these groups and of non-theistic communities is over our shared values. Is can we work together on specific issues and get stuff done, whether we can put our values into action together. And we're often in direct conflict with supremacism of all forms, white supremacy, male supremacy, religious supremacy. And yeah, I've had a lot of different experiences ranging from a Christian joining my student group in college because she wanted to be a pastor and we were the only group that had the deep conversations about religion. And she's a pastor today. Like we still chat. Like I lead an atheist organization. She's a pastor in San Diego. Like that's what came out of the work we had of building secular community and engaging with religious communities. We made a weird choice in college. We did these like religious adventures. We went to different religious communities locally and participated like an anthropology project, and then came back and talked about like how similar or different that is from other religions or our own experiences, which is cool. I think a lot of us have actually rich religious experiences and interactions. But what I've also found is secular leaders have often been at the forefront of most good interfaith work that I've been a part of. The Interfaith Club that started on my campus was leaders that came out of our Secular Student Alliance. When I was on the Secular Student Alliance Board of Directors after college, and we went to the big interfaith event in DC organized by the Office of Faith-Based Initiatives in partnership with the Department of Education. And like, it was really fascinating being in the room, and you've got a leader like Ibu Patel who gets up with leaders of all these organizations and asks the question, I think a lot of us ask in interfaith spaces, like, what are we doing here? Are we here to kumbaya and say, cool, we all can like sit in a room together, like there's some level of acceptance? Or do we exist to do something in the world and our beliefs will come second or third or fourth to those things that we're trying to do, like plant trees or, change criminal justice or, insert issue that you care about. And what's challenging is that I haven't found the same excitement from most religious communities to put the beliefs aside. I do find that there are plenty of groups that share our values enough to do that. I work with a local pastor in here in LA all the time. People like to heal, I can partner with on different projects. Where really like religion is the least exciting part of the conversation. But at the same time, I've also been in spaces like an interfaith march where the Scientologists made up half the people there, and they were questioning why I was there. I'm like, we have a much older tradition than you, but okay. Like these are questions about who gets to access the space and why. And traditionally, the language has been uninviting to us, and we've gotten organized and backbone enough to push back on some of that. But even when the language starts to adapt, right, like there are rituals like prayer that start to happen in those spaces. There are, I've been to city interfaith events here in Los Angeles. They're debating whether we basically create a faith-based initiative type program similar to other cities or the national government. And every meeting was in a church and opened with a prayer. And while that might not mean much to most interfaith people, like half the people in my community are recovering from religion. They have very real trauma from the religions they came from, and they like can't physically sit in that space the way you can as a person of faith, and ignore that it's a slightly different language than yours, right? To be truly inclusive, to truly allow my whole community to come with me, not just me who has 10 years experience at this, like we have to adapt language, we have to think about space, we have to think about who gets platformed, and we have to think about the issues we're doing and who they impact, that I don't see enough of in most interfaith spaces.
Sarah, did you want to add?
Yeah, I really want to piggyback on two things that Evan and Debbie said. So first of all, I do want to say, particularly to the folks of faith on this in this space, is that Debbie's experience and atheist and Atheists United experience that Evan just shared is why so many in our community are skeptical of even trying to join interfaith spaces, right? So, Debbie's saying, I wonder, there's this, coalition, I wonder if they're going to be open to me, right? We want to move to a place where we don't have to ask that question, that we can sort of assume, just like any other person of faith would assume, that they would be welcome in a coalition. And so if you are interested in being an ally to our community, it's really on you to welcome us into that space, because we're already starting from a place where even professionals like us who are really interested in this work, when we talk to our community about doing interfaith work, we can't even guarantee that they're going to be received well or treated with respect. And so, it's really on you to do the work of outreach and inviting, and then also helping us navigate that space, because once even being accepted doesn't mean that it's going to be smooth sailing from there. So having an ally who's going to stand with us and stand by us is really important. Another thing that, Evan, you were talking about the debate and all of that and how it brings out kind of the worst in our community. I'm a big believer that every movement has to own its extremes, right? We can't be distracted with just disassociating with it, right? Every movement has an extreme. And there is a part of the secular movement that is, you could call it anti-theist. They are interested in eliminating religion, but they are, first of all, I would say, they are, like every extreme, a loud minority. They may be the loudest, but they may not. I don't think most people that we work with are not interested in deconverting people. That's really not what we're about. However, we are all interested in making sure that people who are going through a process of questioning their beliefs and want a safe place to do it can do it, right? And we will speak out against people who have faced the kind of trauma that Evan is talking about, whether it's being thrown out of their house, whether it's losing a job, whether it's just losing friends and family connections because they dared to be open about their beliefs. It's often connected to other things like coming out with as LGBTQ, and that coming into conflict with their religious background. And so I think there's a line that we need our faith allies to walk, where, understand that we're not really here as a movement. It's kind of a stereotype, based on a very minority view, that we're here to sort of deconvert you. That's not what we're about. We're here wanting to engage on values, on shared values, how we want to make the world a better place. We have a moral base, right? We atheists and humanist secular people think a lot about what we believe in, right? That absence of a higher power and kind of a structured way of thinking about morality leads us to think a lot about it. And people who believe that there's only one life and one world are really, really motivated to make this one life count and to be good stewards of this one planet that we have. And so we have a lot in common around values and making the world a better place. So if that's how you walk into an interfaith space, is to get things done, like Evan was saying, then we are partners in that. Most of us are, but we we do need to be able to also serve our community. So we're not a threat in the sense that we're trying to deconvert people from your religion, but we do need partners in the faith community, as uncomfortable as it may be, to accept that some people are going to leave religion and they should be allowed to, and to do so safely.
Great. That's given me a lot to think about, and I hope the same is true for the audience. I can see people are already getting posed to ask us questions, and we will leave the last 15 minutes of the hour for that. Perhaps just as a commentary and then a transition, I wanted to share on the same subject how at my previous institution, our most active or sort of interfaith inclined group was our atheists, humanists, and agnostics. I remember on this campus that they were the ones who actively partnered with as many religious student groups to collaborate on an event, especially around asking life's big questions. And it was the atheists who were really leading interfaith initiatives on that campus, which I think is wonderful and is probably not unique to that school. And then I also want to point out that on many other campuses, and depending on the student leadership or so forth, there's interfaith councils on most university campuses, and they can take on a different flavor depending on who's leading. And luckily, I'm on a campus where I can do a bit of the driving and supporting and so forth. But I've heard many stories from other institutions where secular students are made to feel as if they are at a deficit, as if one, they are questioned as to why they would be on an interfaith council, and two, what do they have to offer, right? And it makes me really sad to think that any young adult would have to feel such negative emotions in a room of their peers. But I think Sarah really spoke to some of the ways that interfaith spaces can reframe themselves such that the language and the way we even frame the discussions are better inviting for those across the spectrum. And it's not just, we even have someone here who's a pagan who's saying, yes, I'm underneath that box as well. Buddhists get into the same space. People are like, oh, what do you believe? It's like almost a non-belief as well. And so there's all types of microaggressions being thrown around in interfaith spaces. And it's like all of us can do better, and actually interfaith spaces create an opportunity for us to do better by ourselves, our own learning, and by each other. I'm wondering if at this point, I know Evan, you had shared some slides, but I think Sarah, you also had some prepared, and I'm wondering if this might be a good point to maybe shift the conversation a bit into some of what you wanted to articulate in this next section. Does that make sense? Should we go there?
I'm always a fan of action items. So if you want to, I think the one slide I would definitely want to show is the recommendations, but you showed that already, Evan. So whatever.
Oh, did you? Well, let's pull it up really quick, just because I think we sort of articulated a bit, but I want to revisit. And sorry, Evan, if I'm creating work here. I don't know if all of you noticed my electric actually went out here on campus briefly. And so I missed a few of the slides, and then I was able to log back in. Okay, yeah, so this is a great point. So thank you for preparing this, how to be inclusive. And so you heard it just reflected in this conversation so far. Build relationships with secular leaders, avoid prayer, or include secular ritual within your rituals. Use inclusive language, educate yourself about secular communities. And I think Evan did a great job of really showing the spectrum of organizations available out there, or at least here in the US. Challenge religious privilege. Make note of it in these interfaith spaces, because oftentimes it goes unnoticed or unarticulated, and it's an issue that should be engaged. Share the stage. Yes, I've had a number of opportunities where it made sense that a secular voice should be included, and they just aren't. It says stand by us when we're attacked. Share resources and ask questions. All right.
Can I tell a quick positive story as an example of what can be done? So I worked in politics in Arizona for a number of years, and I worked with a politician named Athena Solomon, who is an open atheist in the state legislature in Arizona. And like most state legislatures around the United States, they open with a prayer, right? A form of, I'm forgetting the formal name of it, but this is given out to where each legislator is able to do at least one prayer during the session, and her being an atheist decided to give a secular prayer. She actually was following in the tradition of Juan Mendez, who was an atheist in that seat before she was elected to that seat, and he also used to give atheist prayers. And something unique happened every single time he gave an atheist prayer to open the session. And again, I should use prayer in quotes, but an invocation, that's the word. And there always was a Christian follow-up prayer that seemed to sneak into the comments immediately following anything he did. Or it seemed like the schedule always got screwed up and he got bumped. And so when Athena gave her prayer to open the session, there was not only a follow-up prayer, but the Speaker of the House actually decided that hers didn't count as a prayer. And was breaking House rules because it wasn't to a higher power. This was wild. It suddenly just brought the whole legislature to a weird halt over some definition of prayer to exclude a non-theist from participating in the opening of the legislative session. We worked with interfaith leaders around the state, a wonderful organization in Arizona, I think it's called the Interfaith Network. Arizona Interfaith Network, and we brought together, I think, about 25 different leaders, and we had a press conference outside of the state legislature in front of a First Amendment statue to talk about this invocation, which was written by a young trans person in our community for Athena, and they stood behind her as she gave a speech about why this mattered, why our community needs representation, and why we're not going anywhere. And that is just the simplest, most obvious thing you can do, is stand with our community when, a small or large attack happens. We are facing constant legislative attacks. We're constantly facing violence and discrimination from schools to hospitals. And there are tons of opportunities for you to stand with us, like the Arizona Interfaith Network did. And it's so simple, and it will be invited if you are willing to drop concepts of theist normativity, step back from religious privilege, and allow secular communities to be fully equal.
Yeah, thank you for that illustrative story, Evan. I love hearing what's going on in these different regions, and that's a great example from your experience in Arizona. So we have about 10 more minutes for this panel, and so maybe we can shift to 10 minutes for us and then 15 minutes for Q&A. Shift our perspectives sort of maybe forward, future focus, and thinking about what opportunities might we see are possible for our secular folks, our secular communities, by being involved in interfaith works. And I think we've touched on a few of them, but maybe we can be more explicit here in really engaging, the possibilities of a truly integrated sort of secular movement that is engaged with our religious and spiritual folks who have been holding down the interfaith organizations and networks for a while. And so, that's the question. What opportunities do secular folks have for being involved in interfaith works in the future? And I'll let you choose the order again. We don't always have to go one way or the other.
If I could start, Evan gave me an idea, which was, of course, focused on elected officials and engaging with them. There is growing momentum for legislators to caucus with one another around these issues, and it's taken a few different forms, but every form of it has been interfaith. And so starting with the Congressional Free Thought Caucus, which was established by Congressman Huffman and Congressman Raskin, McNerney, and Congressman Kildee in 2018. It coincided with Congressman Huffman coming out publicly as an open non-theist, but he co-founded this caucus with his colleagues of faith to address separation of church and state issues, religious freedom issues, protecting scientific integrity, and protecting the rights of religious minorities, including non-theists. There was, and I worked very closely with the humanist group on the ground in Minnesota to advocate for the creation of a secular government caucus that is co-chaired by legislators of faith and openly secular legislators trying to accomplish the same thing and to address directly white Christian nationalism as not just a national issue, but how it's taking form in Minnesota. And so this is a really great way for secular folks and our faith allies to get together and get something done. Because if you believe in religious pluralism in the way we're discussing it, then you're probably also opposed to the version of, quote, religious liberty that is being presented in our politics, which is really just Christian supremacy. Dressed up with language like Judeo-Christian and things like that. And they were, the folks who subscribe to that sort of vision of Christian nationalism have groups of legislators that they feed legislation and ideas to, typically prayer caucuses. And so working with our faith allies, I think the secular community has a real opportunity to work with legislators to address these issues and really organize around these issues more efficiently. And one of the reasons I thought of this as a first suggestion is Evan sharing the experience of Representative Salmon, because that is not an isolated experience. I work a lot with elected officials, and this is happening constantly. The stigma and discrimination that we face as citizens is what legislators face in the legislature once elected, whether it's not being allowed to deliver humanist invocations, which the New Hampshire legislature has not allowed the Secular Values Caucus to do, or if it's, by default not being able to swear in a constitution. There's a state legislator who wanted to swear in on the Constitution, but was given a taxpayer-funded Bible with her name inscribed and the clerk had to kind of figure out when she requested a constitution how to swear her in, right? These are the issues that we're dealing with. And so working with legislators together as interfaith coalitions, I think we can get a lot done together as well.
I'll fill in, but I was trying to organize my thoughts. I think they were in two directions, I think. One, the first thing that always comes to my mind is working on environmental justice and climate change, because just more people need to do that. More people need to do that. And if there are interfaith networks doing that, please invite in the secular people. We need more people. Relatedly, and kind of second, as a higher level, why do this at all? Why be interested in working with secular people? What are the opportunities there? And even thinking about this conversation, I realized I didn't have the answers to some questions I had, which included, why is there even interfaith? Like, what is your plural vision? What do you want to accomplish? And I can read the words on websites and things. And I know that for some people, it's really just, getting to meet different kinds of people with different beliefs. And isn't that interesting? Maybe we'll have dinner parties or conversations. That's fine. That's good. That's great. Great interest. For some, it's looking for avenues for like action, having an impact, justice work. And I think a lot of leaders would like more people to be interested in taking action that has an impact, that can make a change. On the community level, I think there are a million opportunities, and part of that stems from I really believe there are fewer community and social institutions, civic institutions that people can get involved with now in person where they live. Sort of Robert Putnam bowling alone attitude there of, what do you join? I moved to Philly, I moved into a overwhelmingly African-American neighborhood with a very high poverty rate. And I was like, what is there here for me to plug into to do something, to meet my neighbors? You know, where do people get together? And understandably, the pandemic has had a big impact on some of those, but there were fewer anyway. And I know a lot of people get their social connections from online spaces, but we're in bodies in places. And so being able to connect, being able to foster understanding, promote peace and justice where we live in the spaces that we physically inhabit, that's important to me. And that's something that local networks, local community groups can help do. So taking action where we live, having opportunities for community involvement and networking and cooperation, and growing our ability to have an impact where we are is important to me. Just also the sort of psychological and social benefits of being involved in supportive community organizations. When people don't have social connections and community connections, there are worse outcomes socially in their communities. Where I live, there's a very high rate of gun violence. But what else are people going to do? It's a terrible way to think about it. But honestly, there are no clubs. There's no basketball leagues. There's not like really, you know, you find your crew, you find your group. There aren't options. I would love to see options. The churches aren't even that active. And so when I think about the connections that we could make at the community level and just the benefits that has, not just for issues or political representation or anything, but just being able to be connected with people where we live and to build power, to take action, to have an impact where we are is just, I'm very passionate about it. It's very important to me.
Yeah.
I'll leave it there.
Yeah, I'll go real quick. I'll go one rung down for just accessibility to our community. I've been to dozens of vigils over the past 10 years. We've had endless mass shootings and violence against different communities. I've never once heard a secular speaker on stage representing our community and our beliefs, and I've heard religious leaders galore. I've been to political rallies. I've been to inaugurations of political candidates. Sarah and I were at one in LA just a few weeks ago, and you know, it was the classic religious joke. You know, a priest, an imam, and a rabbi on stage, and I just kept looking around and thinking about how the youth were probably one of the largest voting blocs, overwhelmingly identifying as less religious, and are getting politically involved at rates, especially on the left, at higher levels than at any time in American history. And they don't have religious representation on stage, and yet religion was forced on that stage. And organizations like mine have been in LA for 40 years, and nobody thinks to call us and say, do you even want to submit a comment? The least you could do is invite us to be on some platforms. You know, the best is if we can build programs together like Debbie was describing, where we can actually change the structures of our society. You know, we have a food distribution, we're doing local advocacy. I would partner with religious groups left, right, and center if I could do it. There's just nobody asking. And honestly, it's pretty depressing trying to have those conversations with most groups who think we shouldn't exist. So yeah, there are very quick and easy things you can do, like when thinking about the stages you are building and who you are platforming, like adding our name to the list, finding your local secular community. Every major city and most small regions across the United States has a secular community. They have leaders probably ready to go and willing, or call Sarah, Debbie, Vanessa, and I. We will find you somebody if that is a priority of yours. You know, your invocations at your local legislature. These are just things that we've decided are normative in our society, and we're going to continue to do. At the very least, we can try to be more inclusive. At the very best, you can ask a secular person if it should happen and what the most inclusive way would be to do it. So I would start there.
Well, thank you for that. And since I'm looking at the time, I think this would probably be a great opportunity to open up to our Q&A section. I also know that Tahil and URI will be putting a feedback survey in the chat as well. And so As we transition now to the audience, we will accept Q&A for about 15 minutes. And I just wanted to perhaps put a bit of some guidelines around this space since it is meant to be a Q&A. And so if you do have commentary, keep it brief, and but definitely leave us with a question so that we can further engage in this subject matter. And Tahil, I see you. Did you want to add something? You're smiling.
Well, yes. First, I just wanted to offer gratitude to all four of you, because the reason why I stepped back, disappeared, was because I wanted this to be a space that honors your insight and your experiences. And I didn't want to find any way to interrupt that. But secondly, what I did want to do also was actually launch the poll now so that people can fill it out immediately, so that we can just shift properly into the space for, excuse me, Q&A. So let me just launch that now. It'll only take like 2 minutes, if that, and then
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I wasn't aware it was a poll, so let's do it. This is efficient.
It's only 3 questions, so I promise not to make it too challenging. And we are aiming for 100% participation here. But we do want your honest answers. Everyone who's submitting is not going to have their names or anything shared based on the polling, so you don't need to worry about that. We just want to make sure that you're in the space answering honestly to the questions that are posed in front of you. Just need a few more folks to answer. We have about 30 seconds.
You want me to play some Jeopardy music?
No, I think we're okay. All right, last call, 10 more seconds. All right, then, thank you very much for that. Vanessa, go right ahead with your Q&A session.
Awesome. Yeah, so in these last few minutes, we'll open it up. And as I said, please keep your comments brief and have a specific question in mind, and then we'll open it up to our panelists here. And so I'll go in the order that I saw hands. So Morgana, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. This was actually in my hand when we were asked for our experiences, so I'll just try to be very brief on my experiences. One thing I really wanted to point out was historically, after the Second World War, certainly in Europe, there was a huge cultural shift. And one of the cultural shifts also included the local governments, or I should say governments and constitutions, which were in various countries, and there was a general move towards a separation of church and state. So you had a lot of countries which were well, not by default, but were actually becoming more and more secular. So that meant that on the one hand, you saw, as has happened in recent years, a huge shift on what is spirituality, what is religiousness, if you like, And I think when we talk about this whole conversation or the discussion, we also need to look at the cultural differences also between my background being British, Anglo-Dutch, is going to be very different than somebody from America. So I just wanted to point this out, that it's not just such an easy way to say who is secular, because a lot of people would say, I am spiritual, and would not consider themselves to be secular. So that's just what I wanted to put in the arena. And things have changed, certainly in the last 50 years. So I think that needs to be taken on board as well.
Thank you for your sharing. And I think you do bring up a good point in regards to how even the labels we may use will vary in their understanding based on our context, right? And something we didn't mention earlier either is that especially amongst young adults, Evan talked about the nuns, because they're not wanting to affiliate with organized religions, but they're also nuns because so many folks don't even want to take on a label anymore. Maybe atheist, humanist, agnostic aren't even labels worth taking on, and yet it still might be descriptive of a young adult's worldview. And so what does work look like when we're in a post-label world? What does interfaith work look like if people continue to be religious, spiritual, and secular, but without the organizations or the labels that help us understand where we're coming from, right? So great point. Let's go ahead and hear from Richard.
Hi, you can hear me? Okay. I'll talk really fast, so I'll keep it brief. I've been getting myself invited to churches and temples and synagogues for many years to speak as a guest atheist, to talk about what atheism is instead of what it isn't. And I'll talk about what it isn't as well. But the theme is always about accurate mutual understanding without any kind of sales pitch. The very first thing I always say is, I'm not here to change your beliefs about God. I'm here to change your beliefs you probably have about atheists. And everybody immediately relaxes. And from doing that at many different places, I got interested in interfaith groups specifically. And I've been a member of two, and the one that still exists, they're very inclusive. They never had any trouble with me joining as an individual and then joining my whole atheist group as a participating member. And it's, in fact, once they heard me speak, they call me, they invite me, they say, hey, we're having a discussion on this topic, that topic. Please come and be part of the panel. So it works if you always take the high road. And I did a talk just last Sunday at one of these, and I've stolen wonderful ideas from Evan, who really got me thinking about focusing on values rather than identities, as he often talks about. And for the talk that I did, it was just 4.5 minutes long. I changed it to values versus beliefs, because that made it much more easy for all these religious people to understand. And just basically, beliefs are what keep us identified as a group. But when we want to do interfaith work, we need to focus on values, and the values that make people want to help the homeless, the values that make people want to have social justice. So I talked about that, and I got thunderous applause. I mean, they just, wow, that was fantastic, Richard. And so that's really an excellent way to comport yourself at an at an interfaith meeting, is just look for the values, the human values that you share. That's what really brings you together. I don't really have a question. I just wanted to share that and put myself out as another resource, because I have a heck of a lot of stuff I can share with you. A little bit of pushback from atheists about being a part of an interfaith group, but not really, and almost no pushback from theists. They say, "Oh, welcome." So I'm sad to hear that other people get this kind of resistance, but I haven't had much of it since, or for really a long time. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your perspective and experience, Richard. You definitely have a positive outlook on what is possible for this work. So really enjoyed hearing of your experience. All right, moving right along. We have about 4 more hands and 9 more minutes. So let's see if we can do this. Edwina.
Hi, everyone, and thank you. And thank you to the presenters. This is great. Just a great meeting. Thank you. So I'm one of the folks who's involved in a group that's met some resistance. So my organization is Spiritual Playdate, and we have an online program that helps folks deliver social, emotional, and spiritual life skills for kids ages 5 through 11. And our curriculum's delivered in a very Socratic method. We have done our best to be as inclusive as we can. So for example, we offer the option of like an opening prayer or an opening affirmation, like a, happy to share my ideas with you, that sort of thing. So everything's really done for critical thinking. When we talk about world religions, or we talk about what is God, we really try to give a nice broad definition so that kids have a bigger, there isn't a deliberative theology, and there isn't anything that we sort of hopefully direct the kids to, except for maybe values. There's definitely values. So all of that being said, we have reached out many times to different humanist organizations, some atheist organizations, some UUs, and it has been difficult to get engagement. We are producing the Parliament of World's Religions. They're only their second youth and family program, which is Kids of Power this year in Chicago. And we are looking for secular activities to be involved in this so that we can really give a good representation of all the different groups that are out there that are trying to do great work and trying to teach great values. So my question is, I guess, if anyone is interested in that, I would love to connect with you and see if we can find a way to, even if we have to brainstorm and collaborate on an activity, we're looking for interesting activities, and we give you a space and we give you some tables and we promote it on the program. And I would be, more than happy to collaborate with you if we can work together on some of these things. So we have reached out before, but we have met a lot of resistance. I have a specific memory of one that was not very nice. So so let's find a way to do something for the kids, because I think that's where real change starts.
Well, thank you for that invitation, Edwina, and for telling us about the Spiritual Play Day and the ways you've been doing outreach in your region. I also know, the Parliament of World Religions, thankfully, I've seen quite a few secular presentations in the last few gatherings of the Parliament. And so now I'm glad to know that your group is organizing for children, and that you're seeking secular activities. And so I wonder, yes, thank you. I was going to ask for your email because I imagine perhaps Evan, Sarah, Debbie, or us could reach out. Though also if Sarah or Evan or Debbie, if you wanted to say something right now, you're certainly welcome to as well. But I think there are definitely secular resources for children and young adults out there that we can share with you.
I want to give one super small note. Oh, wrong. There we go. Sorry. I want to give one super small note, which is just the history of the secular movement is not something there's a lot of books about. There are very few people like Debbie who have been able to make careers out of it and actually know the history of this movement. It's not that old. I mean, some of our oldest institutions in the United States are 80 years old. When you compare that to a lot of the religious movements that we interact with and the amount of resources they have, it's unbelievable the scale and difference that we're talking about. So 98% of secular communities you're going to deal with do not have any paid staff, have budgets under $5,000, annual budgets of under $5,000. Like, we're talking about very fresh, new communities that struggle with a lot of the progressive community representation issues we have today. They're often like white men have taken leadership of a lot of these groups because that's who has time to run volunteer organizations, retired people from more privileged background historically, which doesn't always match actually the representation of the community we're trying to work towards. So like Sarah, Debbie, and I all and Vanessa work in institutions where we have some level of resources. We have a lot of history to go off of. We all fundraise with our work as well to try to keep this possible. And so I think the challenges actually escalate depending on what type of organization you're working with and their scale. So I just want to like give a little bit of context, because working with Atheists United in LA, far easier. I'm full-time staff. I will call you back within 24 hours if you leave a voicemail. And it is my job to show up at events like that, where a lot of these volunteer organizations, where most of the membership found the organization through a podcast that critiqued religion, it's going to have a very different experience, interaction, and expectations around working with groups like yours. So I'm not saying that you can't work with them. I'm just saying the barriers might be a little higher because of the young history of our social movement we're building.
I would just add a little bit more context as well, which is, and Evan alluded to this earlier, that there are people who have who have trauma, have dealt with trauma from their religious background. And so, just I think, it's unfortunate. I'm sorry to hear you've had that experience of resistance, but, just to maybe, I would just advise you to kind of approach it with a little bit of empathy and realize that some folks are just not in a place where, words even like spiritual will be triggering to them, and they have experiences of people trying to proselytize to them. So they may be making some assumptions. So, really upfront emphasizing how much you are inclusive and respectful of atheist beliefs, and not there to convert them, just like, Richard was sharing earlier, that it's effective for him to say up front, I'm not here to change your beliefs, right, when he presents to church groups. And the other thing is, there are groups that are really all they're trying to do is provide a safe space, and they're not trying to do more. And so, of course, that can be difficult to navigate. This group here can help you find the right group to approach for collaboration. But I would liken it to something like, there's a big difference between an interfaith space that is focused on action and values and, say, a prayer circle, right? Where it's like, we come here to pray, and we're not here for action, we're here to pray. It maybe the closest analogy to that for our community might be people who come together just to talk about religion, criticize it, share their traumatic experiences, and not do anything else, because that's the stage they're at, right? So for us, if we were trying to find collaborative partners around shared values and action, we wouldn't go to the prayer circle, we would go to the interfaith space. And so I would just, think about it that way with your outreach.
Yeah, a very important distinction. Thank you for those thoughts. And those will be our concluding thoughts, because we have been at it for 90 minutes, folks. And I really appreciate the energy that everyone brought to this conversation. My apologies to those who did not have an opportunity to ask a question today, given the limited time. But on behalf of Atheists United and United Religions Initiative, I want to thank first our panelists, Sarah Levin, Debbie Goddard, Evan Clark, for being here today, for sharing your expertise in this area, and for articulating the opportunities for further engagement between the secular world and interfaith initiatives. And so thank you also to the audience, for everyone who came to listen in, and to those watching this video. We appreciate your interfaith efforts, and really welcome every invitation to bring secular folks further into the fold. So thank you. And I guess good night, good evening, good morning, and farewell.